So Memorial Day was originally known as Decoration Day. After the American Civil War, families and communities would gather to decorate the graves of fallen soldiers with flowers, flags, and wreaths. At first, it focused mainly on Civil War soldiers, but after World War I, the meaning expanded to honor all American military personnel who gave their lives in service to the country. One reason that Memorial Day became so meaningful is because it was so deeply personal. Families would literally go to cemeteries together. Children carried flowers, graves were cleaned and decorated, stories were told. It was not originally about sales, cookouts, or even the start of summer. Not always the way it was. It was about remembering. So there was a small boy just staring at the names on a church wall. The pastor noticed him and asked, "Son, what are you looking at?" The boy said, "All these names, who are these people?" And the pastor said, "Well, those are the people who died in the service." And the little boy got wide-eyed. He said, "Was it the Sunday service or the Wednesday service?" Memorial Day is the day that reminds the nation that freedom is costly. One of the most moving Memorial Day traditions in America takes place at Arlington National Cemetery, and it's called Flags In. Before Memorial Day each year, soldiers from the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Regiment, known as the Old Guard, walk through the cemetery and place a small American flag at every grave marker. There are hundreds of thousands of graves, and every flag is placed by hand with precision and care. Every flag is placed exactly 1 boot length from the headstone. They often pause briefly at each grave. Once the process begins, the soldiers remain on guard around the clock to ensure the flags remain standing until Memorial Day. The sight is overwhelming, row after row of white headstones, each one marked with a flag. And behind every stone is a story. A young man who never came home. A medic who died saving others. A parent whose family received a folded flag instead of a reunion. Unknown soldiers whose names may be forgotten by history, but not by God. Many visitors say Arlington is incredibly quiet. Even with crowds present, people instinctively lower their voices. The place itself demands reverence. That atmosphere alone preaches a message about honor, sacrifice, and gratitude. And that's what makes Memorial Day special. It calls us to remember sacrifice. It teaches gratitude. It reminds us that blessings are often purchased by someone else's suffering. It challenges us not to take freedom lightly. A nation that forgets sacrifice eventually forgets gratitude. As powerful as that is, there are seasons in the church that we remember Calvary. Things like communion and Good Friday remind us of the cross. We preach about it often, remembering the suffering. We remember that our spiritual freedom was also purchased with blood. Jesus was wounded for our transgressions. And with his stripes, we are healed. Somebody paid the price for our freedom. That's why we still sing about the blood. That's why we still preach about the cross. That's why we still worship Jesus with passion. I said that's why we still worship Jesus with passion. Freedom always costs something. For our church, Memorial Day will always carry another meaning as well. On Memorial Day 2019, a tornado tore through this area and did massive damage to our church building. It was such a shock walking through the destruction. I remember that night walking through thinking, what are we going to do now? But sometimes God allows moments that make one thing very clear. You cannot stay where you are. There are moments in life when comfort is disrupted, when normal is interrupted, when God begins pushing you out of whatever you were into what you must become. The storm didn't just damage a building, it disrupted complacency. It forced us out of our comfort zone. It reminded us that you cannot always remain where you've been. Sometimes God uses uncomfortable moments to push people into necessary seasons, to push us all into necessary seasons. And that's my burden and my message today. I can't stay where I am. This may be part 2 of what David Jennings preached last week. He said, the frustration you're feeling is because God is getting ready to take you to another level. So let's just double down on that and linger here for a while. I can't stay where I am. And understand this, God will make sure of it. Even if we want to stay, we're going to have to do something because God will make sure that I can't stay where I am. So Israel entered into Egypt as honored guests. Joseph had saved the nation. Pharaoh welcomed them almost like royalty. But over time, what once felt like favor became bondage. The place that protected them eventually imprisoned them. And here's the truth. If Egypt had remained comfortable, Israel probably would have never left. If there had been no pressure, no slavery, no burden, they may have never cried out for deliverance. They may have never seen the Red Sea part and walk across on dry ground. They may have never walked toward the promised land. Sometimes God allows discomfort because something better is waiting on the other side of the trouble. God will disturb what you are willing to settle in when He has something greater prepared for you. God doesn't want you to settle. He doesn't want me to settle. There are seasons when you realize, I can't stay where I am. It's no longer an option for me to stay where I am. Listen now, Egypt was never supposed to be home. It was only supposed to be a temporary provision during a famine. But generations passed, people adjusted, lives were built, routines were formed. And before long, God's people had become comfortable in a place that was beneath their calling. So God allowed pressure to enter Egypt, not because He hated Israel, but because He loved them too much to leave them there. The bondage created a hunger for deliverance. The suffering created a desire for promise, because sometimes the reason God makes a season uncomfortable is because He's calling you to somewhere greater. I can't stay where I am. I wish somebody who's going through it today would just say it just to yourself. I can't stay where I am. I've been here long enough. God's making things uncomfortable, so I cannot stay where I am. Even after Israel left, they repeatedly talked about going back to Egypt. When the pressure rose at the Red Sea, because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? When they lacked water, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? When they lacked food, would God we had died in the land of Egypt, where we sat by the flesh pots. We remember the fish which we did eat freely in Egypt. After the spies brought back their report, would God we had died in Egypt. Let us make a captain and return to Egypt. They kept wanting to go back. Every battle, every hardship, every uncomfortable season, they'd start talking about Egypt. Let us go back. We had food there. We had security there. At least we knew what life looked like there. And you understand that Israel had some selective memory, right? Isn't it amazing how people romanticize the places that God has delivered them from? They were slaves. Okay, remember that. They're slaves, getting whipped, making bricks. Their babies were taken and killed. And suddenly out in the wilderness, they're talking about Egypt like it's some sort of all-inclusive 5-star resort that they just left. Man, remember the food we had in Egypt. Yeah, remember the slavery too. They killed your baby. Some people want freedom as long as freedom stays comfortable. They were headed toward promise, but their hearts were tied to bondage. Israel kept talking about Egypt because people often crave familiar bondage more than unfamiliar freedom. God could bring Israel out of Egypt in one night, but it took him 40 years to get Egypt out of them. And like Lot's wife, they looked back and they never, somebody say never, they never possessed what God had prepared for them. But their children were different. That next generation had spent the last 40 years in wilderness. They buried their parents in the sand. They lived in tents. They ate manna every morning. And when they finally stood at the edge of the promised land, they didn't see Egypt behind them. All they saw was the promise in front of them. In their minds, there was no going back now. They had wandered too long. They had endured too much. The first generation wanted to go back to Egypt. The second generation was basically saying, listen, we've been eating manna for 40 years. We're crossing Jordan if we got to swim. We're going over. We are going to the other side. They were going to take the land or die trying because they had already decided we're never going back to that wilderness again. Listen, sometimes you just got to make a decision. I'm never going back. I have decided to follow Jesus, and I'm not going to turn back. There's nothing that world has to offer me anymore. There's nothing I left in the world that has any pull on me anymore. I have decided to follow Jesus, and I cannot turn back. I can't stay where I am. I can't go backward. I can't return to old bondage. I can't return to my old ways. God has brought me too far to turn around now. The generation that entered the promised land was the generation that finally decided going back is not an option. I have decided to follow Jesus. This world has nothing to offer me. Deuteronomy 32:11 says, Moses is writing this to that group in the wilderness. Deuteronomy 32:11 says, like an eagle that stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them aloft. The picture is so powerful. An eagle's nest is built to be soft and comfortable inside. The mother eagle lines it with feathers and soft material to protect the eaglets while they're small. But there comes a point when the comfort becomes dangerous. The young eagle, if they stay in the nest forever, it will never become what it was created to be. So the mother eagle begins to stir the nest. She removes some of the soft lining. The nest becomes uncomfortable. The eaglet becomes restless. Eventually, the mother nudges the young out of the nest toward the open air. The eaglet falls. The mother eagle swoops down underneath and catches it on her wings, lifts it back up, and forces it to try again and again and again. And listen, brothers and sisters, sometimes God disturbs our comfort to develop strength. That's exactly what Moses was telling Israel in Deuteronomy. Israel thought the wilderness was abandonment, but God was training them to fly. God was getting them ready for what he really had for them. Listen to me now. Sometimes the reason the nest gets uncomfortable is because staying there would keep you from becoming what God has designed you to be. God has a plan for every person in this room, every person watching online. God will disturb the nest before he allows you to die inside of it. The eagle does not stir the nest because it hates the eaglet. She stirs the nest because she sees something the eaglet can't see yet. You were not born to live in this nest forever. You were born to soar. You were born to fly. You were made for more. God's got a plan for your life. God's got a purpose for your life. God's got a calling on your life. You're made for more than this. The young eagle thinks the nest is falling apart. The mother eagle's thinking, nope, you're just getting too comfortable. Some of us rebuke the devil. Poor devil. And it's just God in there removing some feathers. Devil had nothing to do with it. Egypt became uncomfortable because God was stirring the nest. The wilderness became uncomfortable because God was stirring the nest. And sometimes the discomfort in our lives is not punishment, it's preparation. It's God preparing us for what he has next. The Pilgrims didn't leave England because life was easy. They left because of pressure, persecution, and lack of religious freedom. The journey on the Mayflower was brutal. Many died. The first winter was devastating, but had they stayed where they were comfortable, they never would have become part of the founding of a new nation. Sometimes the future God has for you cannot be reached without leaving familiar territory. Before becoming president, Abraham Lincoln experienced repeated business failures, election loss, depression, and personal tragedy. Many people would have stopped, but the very hardships that seemed to bury him helped shape the leadership the nation would later need. We needed Abraham Lincoln to be who he was. Orville and Wilbur Wright ran a small bicycle shop right here. Failure after failure came during their experiments. If they had accepted staying where they were, aviation history would be completely different. Sometimes progress requires leaving the safety of what already works. And remember this, God still uses imperfect people in imperfect situations. If you're waiting till life is perfect, until you're perfect, the trumpet's gonna sound before you do anything. Go ahead and work before you're ready. Go ahead and step out while you're still imperfect. Go ahead and do something while life isn't right. Go ahead and go after God with everything you've got. The Great Chicago Fire destroyed much of Chicago. At the time, it looked like total devastation. But the rebuilding of Chicago transformed it into one of the great modern cities in America, leading it to new architecture, safer construction methods, and massive growth. What looked like destruction became the beginning of rebuilding stronger than ever before. And that's basically what happened with us in 2019. The tornado damaged the building. At the time, it felt painful, uncertain, and disruptive. Everybody didn't stay with us through that journey, but I'm glad you did. But looking back now, I can see something clearly. God would not let us stay where we were. We wouldn't be here if we had stayed there. Sometimes storms do damage, but also sometimes storms drive us out of our comfort zone. That's not just history, that's our testimony. I remember after the tornado, there was devastation everywhere. It looked like a third world country for a little bit. Trees down, buildings damaged, entire neighborhoods turned upside down overnight. But I also remember something else, and you remember this too. I remember people coming together. I remember our church pulling together. I remember our city pulling together. It became Dayton strong. It became New Life strong. People showed up with chainsaws. They brought food and water. They checked on neighbors. People opened homes. In the middle of destruction, unity rose up across our city and across our church. Maybe that's one of the things God was trying to show us. Sometimes the storms reveal a strength that we didn't know we had. Sometimes pressure pulls people apart, but sometimes pressure pulls people together. The enemy thought the storm would weaken us, but somehow God used it to strengthen us, increase compassion, and remind us that we belong to each other. We're there for each other. We're going to help each other. We learned something in that season. You can survive anything. Listen to me now. We talk about it in recovery on Tuesday night a lot. You can survive anything if you don't try to survive it alone. Listen to me now. Stop losing friendships over stupid stuff. Amen. Listen, I have people that will upset me, and I get my little short fuse will rise up. I'm like, I'm done with them. Then when I come back to my senses, I remember I don't have enough friends to start cutting people off. I better just work this out. I got to get over it. I got to listen to Elsa and let it go. I got to make this right. Sometimes you just got to forgive and move on. They didn't say sorry. Who cares? Forgive and move on. Sometimes you just got to say, I'm sorry, and move on. Listen to me now. Unresolved situations have a way of following us wherever we go. We may as well just humble ourselves and make it right. First one to humble yourself wins. What James Kilgore used to say. I believe one of the greatest dangers in uncomfortable season is isolation. We need each other. Listen, if you're alone today, you need to connect up with a brother, connect up with a sister. We need each other, especially in storms. We need each other. Many of the greatest chapters in history began with something people never would have chosen. A storm, a famine, a prison, a betrayal, a fire, a wilderness. But God has a way of using uncomfortable seasons to move people toward his promises. In 2 Kings 7, the city of Samaria was under siege by the Syrians. The famine became so severe that people were starving inside the walls. Outside the gate sat 4 lepers, cut off from the city because of their condition. And finally, one of them said, "Why sit we here till we die?" And they reasoned something. They said, if we stay here, we're going to die. If we go into the city, we're going to die. We may as well do something. It's not exactly great faith, but it worked for them. Didn't start as confidence. It started as a refusal. Listen to me now. It started as a refusal to die where they were sitting. Sometimes you just got to decide, I'm not going to die here. This isn't, I may die for something, but I'm not going to die because of this. I can't stay where I am. I'm not going to sit here till I die. So 4 lepers walked toward the enemy camp. When they arrived, God had already moved. Syrians had fled in panic, leaving food, silver, gold in abundance. The miracle was not discovered by people who stayed frozen in fear. It was discovered by people willing to move. Sometimes you got to reach the point where staying is no longer survivable. I can't stay here anymore. Why sit we here until we die? There are moments when God allows life to become so uncomfortable. Let's make it personal. There's moments when God allows my life and your life to become uncomfortable enough that movement finally becomes possible. Because if they had stayed at the gate, they never would have discovered the miracle waiting just outside the camp. I love the honesty of the 4 lepers. There was no committee meeting, no 12-week seminar, just one line. Why sit we here till we die? That's one of the shortest leadership meetings in the Bible. Listen, sometimes a spiritual breakthrough begins when somebody finally says, well, this isn't working. God often uses disruption, tragedy, pressure, or loss to move people into places they never would have discovered otherwise. Never would have found it had it not become uncomfortable. Joseph was betrayed, thrown into a pit and sold into slavery, but if he had stayed home with his father, he would have never reached the palace. Moses fled Egypt as a fugitive and a failure, but on the backside of the desert became the place where he encountered the burning bush, and God said, take off your shoes, you're standing on holy ground. Ruth lost her husband in Moab, but her tragedy led her to Bethlehem, where she became part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. David was driven into caves by Saul, but the caves prepared him for the throne. Elijah was forced into the wilderness, exhausted and afraid, but that's where he heard the still small voice of God. It was persecution that scattered the early church from Jerusalem. But what looked like tragedy actually spread the gospel over the whole world. It's why we've got the gospel today. It's because God didn't let them get comfortable in Jerusalem. Paul's imprisonment looked like limitation, but prison became the place where much of the New Testament was written. Oh, I wouldn't want to try to do this without those letters Paul wrote from prison. For the prodigal son, famine and brokenness destroyed his false confidence, became the very thing that brought him home to Father's house. Sometimes God allows what feels like loss because he knows we would never move otherwise. Sometimes one door only opens after another door closes. Some promises are only discovered after comfort is disrupted. And that's why there are moments in life when I have to declare, I can't stay where I am. Today's Pentecost Sunday. Pentecost means 50. Pentecost is 50 days after the cross. At Calvary was darkness, betrayal, fear, blood, and death. But just 50 days later, there was fire from heaven, boldness, revival, thousands receiving the Holy Ghost. And by the way, you can get that today. If you want the Holy Ghost, you can get that today. He's still pouring it out today. Calvary looked like the end, but Pentecost proved God was leading them to something greater. So there comes a point in our story when we must go from why me to what's God trying to teach me? What's God up to? What's God wanting to do in my life? What's God preparing me for? What's God leading me to? What does my future hold? If God's trying to get my attention, then I need to pay attention. I said, if God's stirring up the nest and he's trying to get my attention, I better pay attention. Is the sickness for a reason? Is the hurt for a reason? What if it's not the devil, but God? Is the season for a reason? God, what are you leading me to?